Welcome back to HMA 2021, and we're down to the final session for day one of the conference. Now, we all know there's a lot of news out there about COVID-19. In fact, it's almost all anyone is talking about these days. So it's no surprise that amidst that, there's also a ton of fake news and false information about the virus floating around. But is there a vaccine for the COVID-19 medical infodemic? Joining us today to share his thoughts on this subject is Tim Morris, the Commercial Portfolio and Partnership Director of Elsevier. If you have any questions for Tim, do send it in the chat and we'll try to get them answered in the Q&A segment later on. But for now, a very warm welcome to HMA, Mr. Tim Morris.
Thank you, Noah. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon and to join you. I only wish it could be in person, and perhaps, after connected with several of you today during the meeting, that we'll be able to connect in person next time. I'd like to congratulate you also on the platform and the subject areas. It's been fantastic so far today. Thank you very much. So I come from Elsevier, perhaps one of the largest providers of health information, analytics, and hospital information across the globe. And perhaps some of the information that you're reading every single day of the week. In fact, in some of the sessions, I've heard the name of the Lancet mentioned as well. Undoubtedly, we're living in an infodemic at this time. Many of you will remember the age of 24-hour news coming online. We sat glued to our screens watching the 9/11 as it happened in real time. We started to consume information in a way that was immediate, but it was controlled, and it was through sources which we had grown to know, we respected. And therefore, to a degree, there was an element of trust in those news organizations. A decade later, and we move into the world of the Twitter feed, the Instagrams, the Facebook, and we start to see a mass collection of information being put in front of us. We consume that information in different ways every day. I treat Twitter as a source of immediate what's going on, what's happening when the news outlets don't have that information. If I want to dig deeper and understand what's happening, I'll turn to the 24-hour news channels and hear more of the details, see more of the images. But if I want to really understand, then I will start to read the journals, read the newspapers, the articles where there's been time to understand that information and actually start to interpret what's going on. This news cycle, this move towards rapid information is proving to be an incredible challenge, not just for real news, but also to fight fake news as well. This started around 2016. We started to really notice this during the Trump first election, where we started to see fake information becoming the term of the day. More information was flooded onto our systems through Twitter, through Facebook, and people were having trouble discerning what was right, what was fact, and what was fiction. And actually, you can see from this graph here how trust has been eroded in many of what we would previously consider to be highly respected journals, highly respected TV outlets, highly respected newspapers. And it's been eroded significantly over the last year as well, as the pandemic exploded onto the global circuit. We start to see the impact of this in the messaging across the different countries, not just in the US, where this was obvious in terms of its outcome, but in other countries as well, as we move through this infodemic. One of the challenges that we found is that, in fact, that the information is more likely to be spread if it is actually false information. This is highly worrying for an organization that actually spends its life trying to increase the amount of factual available information for doctors, nurses, and patients globally. And the challenge that we have as an organization is that the more alarmist an article is on the internet, the more attention and attraction it's likely to get. So in fact, we can't even break through the news cycle to get the truth out there. And we've seen this significantly in the last year. We notice, particularly in some areas, politics is an obvious area where the fake information is trending very quickly out in society. Urban legends and misinformation about science is also out there. And we know that 70% is more likely to be retweeted if it is false about politics, legends, urban legends, or science than it would be the truth. And this is the challenge that we face every day. So looking back in the past, because this is not exactly new, and we've seen this in medical information as well. Now, the definition of a misinformation is when false information is shared, but no harm is meant. Now, we see this a lot. We see this amongst people who are giving home remedies, people who are suggesting treatments that may work. They don't intend to cause any harm for anyone. However, that misinformation will rapidly spread through the internet. Now, disinformation is when false information is knowingly shared to cause harm. And this is the really worrying one. We don't understand necessarily the motive behind doing this, but there are reasons, and people are using disinformation to try and cause harm across the globe. So looking back in the past, when we look at the Ebola epidemic, we actually started to see that medical misinformation was actually more likely to be tweeted. Not significantly, but it was more likely to be tweeted. However, the problem was that the readership was significantly greater than the potential readers of the real information. And so the information you would want people to see. And then as we moved down to Zika as well, Zika became a particular challenge because people were suggesting that Zika was in fact not a major problem. It was actually government information was being put out there to challenge this. And you can see 10 reasons why the Zika virus fear is another fraudulent medical hoax and vaccine industry funding scam. And this is a real problem because if you're trying to fight a pandemic, then the last thing you need is to have your vaccine start to be put down. We see this with measles, and in fact, the rise of measles following the MMR scare. And we're still challenged every year with a reduction in numbers of people who are having the measles vaccine, down from 91% in the UK down to 80% after that scare. It's hard to reverse that kind of information. Another challenge, of course, is that the people we respect, those that we would expect to give us the truth, aren't necessarily the ones who are doing that for us. So looking at this graph on the top right-hand side, you'll notice that, in fact, the top-down misinformation, the people like Donald Trump, the people who are prime ministers, who are our leading influencers, whether that's on the internet, whether it's YouTube, or whether it's through standard social media, those produce 20% of the misinformation. The problem we then have is that 69% of the population then share that information. And so that it goes global, it goes out fast. And in fact, amongst the most viewed English videos regarding COVID, 27% of that contain non-factual information, reaching 62 million people worldwide. It's a significant challenge that we all have. Some of the fallacies that have been put out there about the vaccine, it's 5G rigged. I know that I would prefer to have a much better 5G signal. If that's the way to get it, then perhaps that's what we should be doing. But it's a misinformation, and it's potentially disinformation because it causes harm when people will stop getting the vaccine and they won't move forward with this. The impact, the negative impact of this misinformation and disinformation can be significant. Now, one of the challenges as a publisher of journal information is that you want to get this information out to as many people as possible. We've seen a trend moving from subscribed journals to open source journals and open access journals. And that's changed the dynamic slightly of the way that journals are created, where articles are published at cost, so people can pay to have their journal articles published without peer review, then you have a change potentially in the quality of that information. And we know that where people don't have good access to high quality journals, then there is a higher risk of misinformation or disinformation within those as well. Fake news, misinformation or disinformation can kill. And we've seen that hundreds are dying of poison after that methanol cure was suggested. We've also seen that in the United States, where people were taking the non-regulated dose of a particular drug, and they were taking poisons which are effectively used for standard disinfection as well. So the challenge that we have is when our influencers spread misinformation or disinformation, the majority of the population of the Twitter sphere or the Facebook groups will share that information widely, and people will be harmed in that way. This is this slide here actually is an interesting one. It was supposed to build, so I'll talk you through it. Left-hand side here. One of the botnets that were put in during the Brexit debate in the UK, about 13,000 of them, started to tweet about Brexit and start to influence the vote. That's a very political way of challenging. And what we noticed after the Brexit vote was actually most of those accounts disappeared. So we know that there's an electronic way that information is being spread across the globe. Now, that's quite political. I'm a fan of Formula One, and I watched the race this weekend. I was a big fan of Lewis Hamilton, very disappointed to see the car land on top of his and destroy his race. And for me, that was actually a moment where I feel anger, disappointment, and I turned to my standard form of social media, Twitter in this case. And I actually picked up this Twitter feed from the Formula One. And it's very interesting, the information that you see. And if you constantly look at these Twitter feeds, you start to understand that there are patterns from the bots within there. And I spotted this one. Hamilton, jokes aside, I'm actually pretty concerned that at some point he's going to be involved in a really dangerous crash, potentially involving other drivers. The guy literally can't control the car. He's a danger to himself and others at that moment. Now, I checked that out because I'd seen that previously in the last crash when Verstappen had actually been accused of exactly the same words. And so I did a search on those words within Twitter and immediately found hundreds and hundreds of this tweet put out simultaneously across the internet. The bots were changing my opinion and changing the opinion of others at the same time. We saw anger coming out. Now, I don't know the reason for this, whether it was to create interest in the race, whether it's to devalue Lewis Hamilton, whether it's to increase Verstappen's position. What I do know is it creates reaction. And this is often the problem we have with our bots. We don't know whether it's human or whether it's electronic. I don't want to be completely negative about our social media. However, we've seen it work for good. We need to understand how we do that. And we believe, and this was actually in the Lancet, that social media can have a crucial role in disseminating health information and tackling infodemics and misinformation. It has a crucial role. And this paper actually from the Elsevier journal as well, this was leveraging the Twitter data to understand people's reaction to the COVID messages that are going out there. We can actually understand a lot from what is happening in the news by looking at people's reaction. And if we can understand that data when it's a true account, not a bot, we can start to understand the sentiment and whether we're getting our message out to our patients globally. So fighting an infodemic is actually a huge challenge. We have at the very top, we have the suspicious information analysis which is required. We actually have trouble doing that ourselves. I have trouble discerning when I'm being wound up by the bots on the Formula One Twitter feed. So we need systems that can actually identify those and tag those. We saw that during the election this year in the United States, where information was tagged as misinformation. We then saw that again in the pandemic with the information which flagged that this is unproven information and should not be shared in that way. And we've even seen control in social media where they've tied it down and not allowed sharing information. Fake news detection needs to be automated to a degree, but with the amount of information coming onto the internet, it's very hard to do that. And so we need humans to intervene as well. So knowledge from professionals becomes important. And that's where clinicians come in. Clinicians need to filter information and understand whether it's fact or fiction as well. So we need alert systems, detection systems, but we also need intervention as well. And we need to immunize our users with true news. And this is really important. So as healthcare providers, as doctors, as nurses, we need to ensure that we only share information which is factual, relevant. We actually prolifically share that information when we can through the internet so that we share the facts, not the fiction, and don't become part of the problem as well. So moving on from that feeling of volume of information, we know that we have trusted information sources, whether that's the trusted news media that are reporting the truth, whether it's the healthcare providers that are providing the health information. We need a source of truth. However, we also need to bridge the gap between the publication of information and making it clinically practical as well. I used to complain that it took 17 years to get 14% of our research into practice. Now, that was a complaint a year ago before the pandemic, and we've seen a mass of information on the coronavirus and how that has changed the creation of new drugs and the ability to actually deliver a vaccine for the pandemic over that year. So that proliferation of information has been amazing. In fact, the number of publications has been increasing for many years, but has accelerated over the last year in particular areas. So number of publications on artificial intelligence and health medicine and healthcare would increase by 625% over the last 5 years. A huge amount of information and far too much for any one of our clinicians to understand what is fact and fiction amongst that kind of information. You have to have filters. You have to have information which is relevant. And that information needs to be not only trusted from the source, but it needs to be evidence-based as well. So looking at the trend for COVID-19 research during the pandemic, these are the number of COVID-19 related articles in Scopus, and you can see that rapid uptake of the information. And there's a huge amount of information within there. And we know that actually a good quality study, which is peer reviewed and put out and shared, can have positive impact. We also know that a poorly designed study can negatively impact the health message out there. And some articles, even those published in the Lancet last year, actually were retracted when it was identified perhaps the data source was not large enough or significant enough to impact patients. And new studies needed to be created to take that forward. So we're not just fighting this epidemic or pandemic, we're fighting this infodemic, as the World Health Organization announced early last year. Now, I want to do a poll at this stage on your screens. I hope you can see on the chat next to the chat, question and answers, a poll. Now, in there, I've asked the question, veterinarian ivermectin is currently approved for use in healthcare for treatment of COVID-19. Is that fact or fake? Are there trials? Are there other things going on? Now, if you could quickly go into that and actually just select your answer for me, they'll feed me the results hopefully shortly in terms of that information. Now, the reason I asked this question is I had a contact from, I'm part of a clinical best practice council within Elsevier, and we discussed regularly some of the topics in COVID. And we'd seen that there was actually no source of veterinarian ivermectin within Brazil. It had been used up. and was starting to be used in terms of treatment potentially for COVID as well. So the question really is the drug available for its use in that way? As clinicians, of course, we need to ensure that we know the answer to those. Now, I don't know whether we've got some poll results coming in at this stage, whether they can be shared with me. And what I'll do is I'll just move on to the next slide as you do that. So ivermectin and its efficacy in treatment of COVID. So we actually, poll results, okay. Yes, 4.8, no, 42.9, only in clinical trial, 47.6, and for other use, 4.8. That's actually very interesting. And it's great to see those results as they come in. And if you go to Twitter and you do a search on ivermectin, you'll actually find multiple reactions from clinical people, private providers, as well as the general public talking about this drug. The one on the left-hand side from Japan, indicating that it actually was used in Japan and being used in perhaps in cases, and there was sort of a reduction. Yet if you read below that Twitter feed, it indicates the drug has not been approved for use in that environment. This is where we need to take trusted sources. We need to go back to the source of the information to determine what the facts are. I did a search on Clinical Key and identified there was 1,503 articles, I think it was, on ivermectin. We've got a drug monograph on that. And we know that ivermectin is actually used for antiparasitic drug within healthcare in humans. However, it's not at the moment got any proven efficacy within the treatment of COVID-19, although trials have started, and there are trials in terms of the way that it may impact the pandemic in the future, or the endemic in the future. So the answer is yes, only in clinical trials is perhaps true. It's also true that no, it's not used in COVID-19. The other thing, of course, is I use the word veterinarian. I would hope that we're actually not horses, and we're actually using the human version of the drug as we do these clinical trials as well. And so it's a little bit of a trick question there. The poll has changed slightly. We've now got 42% yes, 4.2% yes, no 50%, only in clinical trials 39.6, and for other use 6.3. So as clinicians, we need to go to a trusted source. We need to find that information so we can talk to our patients and say, it's not currently available for COVID-19. It is being researched. You will hear the results of those research. It may be used in COVID in the future. It's not available today. So challenges remain. We need to share from our trusted sources, evidence-based information, and we need to get that to the clinicians in a way that they can consume and they can use. And that really is the responsibility of the doctors and the healthcare providers to ensure that information is there. So trusted, we go back to that word. It's a really interesting area. Who do we trust? Do we trust our political leaders? Do we trust our healthcare providers? Do we trust the pharmaceutical companies? I think one of the challenges we have is actually finding that trust amongst the public as well amongst the doctors. We actually feed our information into the World Health Organization, who are actually consolidating all of the information available for people within the COVID community to use in research in different ways as well. We at Elsevier have tried to reduce the amount of false information out there by providing free access to trusted information, which is evidence-based. We provide that evidence through our COVID-19 healthcare hub, the same information that gets fed to the World Health Organization as well. We believe it's really important that doctors can go to a trusted source without political influence, without pharmaceutical influence, without public influence, so that we can actually find the facts rather than the fiction behind the truth and information. Looking at the way that our doctors search, it's very similar, in fact, to the patterns of discovery when we're creating knowledge and information. These are the trends of the last pandemics. You'll notice there we've got the SARS, the MERS, we've got influenza, and with the other pandemics as they were created. You'll see this wave, this peak of information is created. At the same time, search for that information is really important. And we drive our doctors to trending information within trusted sources to make sure they know what the right information is. And actually, we know that during the first 4 months of the pandemic, this time, there was more information created than the whole of the period of SARS and MERS over that period as well. So being able to search that information and find it is incredibly important. So we would really ask healthcare providers to stop doctors, stop nurses using untrusted sources, Googling for their answers, and to be directed to use World Health information, to use trusted sources to bring back the information they require in their practice. Using Clinical Key, you're able to identify those particular treatments associated with that drug. There are other providers of systems that provide trusted source of knowledge and information as well. We encourage to use trusted sources at the provider level. But it's not just the fact that we're talking to doctors and nurses. We're also talking to the public. And one of the real challenges we have is that actually you need to share accurate information which is not being twisted through social media, and you need to point people back to the evidence each time so that they can trust the source of that information. We've made our information available as well on an international basis to the public, because we actually think that it's important they have the same knowledge and information that the doctors do, updated as soon as they have that information. So we've been sharing this through social media to try and encourage patients to go to an accurate source rather than necessarily their friends' information. And we see this happening amongst providers within the social media as well. And in fact, this is one of the tweets that was put out there in Singapore regarding ivermectin and its use or non-use, in this case in COVID-19. Please do not self-medicate. We've also seen the effective use within Malaysia as well of social media to get messaging out, preparedness for vaccine, giving to teenagers aged 18 and below. So social media can be used when using trusted information and pushed out by the trusted sources within that as well. Evidence-based information. Key takeaways I really want you to take from this is there is false information out there that can cause harm to the public. That is significant, and we need to try and find ways of controlling that. And institutions, healthcare providers, the politicians, even the influencers, must help us to get the accurate information out there. We need to control the right information to the general population. And we need to access and share reliable sources rather than just the information on the web. And I love this cartoon. You'll have access to this after the event, I'm sure, to be able to see this in detail. This cartoon really is for public consumption in terms of getting the message across of why there was a pandemic, how that pandemic started, and how scientists, researchers started to find a cure for this, how the misinformation, fake news, really was challenging that across the globe. Also, the information about variants and new variants and how we are tackling those in the future. But then as we move on and we move to the final chapter, of course, we're now moving from this pandemic into an endemic. And this is going to be here for some period of time. We need clinicians to keep updated with the latest findings, keep on top of that. We need patients to be assured that the right evidence-based information at the right time is available to them. And I don't believe there's ever been a more important time to control the infodemic in health. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand back to Noah and perhaps take some questions.
Thank you, Tim. We've now come to the Q&A segment for this session, and we've already got a few questions, some more of a statement rather than a question, but we'll get to them, and we'll try to get all of them answered. And do continue to send in your questions in the chat box, and let's go. All right, so the first one is from Sesha Salam Murugesan. And I'm asking this mostly because I think it is very relevant in terms of the trust that people have in official news sources, because he asked, why is every country giving wrong data on COVID death and vaccinations? Is there any particular reason or politics behind this? So I think that's just symptomatic of what you mentioned, like the kind of distrust that people have in official news sources.
I think there is a lot of information underneath that question. I'd recommend actually Richard Horton from The Lancet has actually written a book on in some of the information that's coming out and reasons for information being given in different ways. From a personal point of view, I find it quite challenging. I'm in a country where we have an average of 38,000 new cases per day. That to me feels massive. If you talk to the public, the story is we're over the pandemic. We're now in growth. We're coming back to normal behavior again. And there are people who don't wear masks in shops. Normal social contact. I personally still wear a mask when I go into shops, but I do feel like I'm different to many other people. Why is there a difference in terms of that message? And we know that actually politicians, governments are challenged in terms of getting out of lockdown, bringing back economy. And we also know that we have a real challenge in terms of the number of patients who have not yet been treated for diseases that are not COVID, who are on waiting lists, who are waiting for surgery, who are waiting for basic treatment. We believe there's going to be a cancer problem in the future because of the delays in treatment. So I think that there are perhaps genuinely good reasons why people report data in different ways and put a different nuance on it. I don't necessarily think that is always misinformation. It's the way that people use information. I think when it distorts the truth, when people hide facts, that is more damaging. And so if people are not reporting the actual numbers of deaths or the numbers of infections, they might then they have more harm than if they're reporting it in a politically motivated way. It is a challenge.
I cannot agree more. Okay, next question. We've got two related questions from the audience. And the first one is, how would you recommend to manage clinicians who believe in fiction or somehow already have formed his or her own cognitive bias? And on a related question, why are there still a stubborn bunch of doctors who continuously advocate for ivermectin use?
Yeah, I think that is a huge challenge. I think one of the things about the information that we're providing, and it is a real challenge. If you ask the doctor, hydrochloroquine, does it have an impact a year ago, then you would have had completely divergent opinions. Those who believe that the drug had an impact, those who didn't believe it had an impact. What we know is that if you can put trial data in front of people and you can demonstrate that it's accurate trial data, and we know that in some cases, in that particular instance, small studies were used to disprove its use, and it wasn't big enough to necessarily be an accurate study. So we need big studies. We need to understand the evidence. Now, all I can say to clinicians is go to your trusted source. I at Elsevier would say go to Clinical Key, because that is a trusted source. We believe you can not only find what we have as evidence treatment, you can find the clinical trial data, which actually shows what clinical trials are ongoing, which ones have been completed, and which ones have efficacy at the end of them. So I would encourage, move away from standard searches, Twitter feeds, and actually look to global evidence-based content, trusted sources, and use that as your information source.
Great answer. And you mentioned Twitter feeds and Facebook platforms, and we've got this question from an audience member. How much responsibility do you think social media platforms should take in the fight against the infodemic? And I'll add on to this, where do you think the main responsibility of sieving out fake news lies? Is it at the feet of social media platforms, or maybe at the consumer itself, just taking the extra step to go do some research of their own instead of believing the first thing that they read? Or does it lie at the media, the governments? What do you think?
I can speak from my personal opinion. I think when you look at the amount of, you open Twitter, you look at the speed that information comes into Twitter. It's very difficult to regulate for any individual what is factual, what is fiction, before you get swept up in the information. You start to perhaps share false information. So I think that there is a responsibility for the social media platforms to help control that. I do believe that actually when something's been completely disproven is dangerous, then social media platforms should be tagging that information and actually making it clear this is not accurate information and is potentially harmful. I think the challenge they have, though, is how do you do that? And looking at the studies in the use of artificial intelligence in terms of machine learning from that vast amount of information, they have huge challenges because you need to have learning sets which are actually human generated as well as machine generated because of the bias of the volume of information that comes in. So they have a challenge. And I think this is really exciting for the people who are in data analytics, in machine learning, who can actually start to understand how information is generated. I do believe they have a responsibility. I think we have a responsibility as a public as well to step back, to pause. And if you remember, there was actually a hashtag to pause when you read social media to say, does that sound factual? Before I share, does it sound real? And I think we as a human race need to actually start to take responsibility as well for people that we may influence or harm. And if you remember, that 20% of the influencers, the political leaders, the influencers on YouTube, they're the ones who can have a very large amount of influence on the total population. So we need them to take responsibility particularly.
All right. So it sounds like it's everyone's responsibility, right? From the top to the bottom, whole society. We just have to be a bit more discerning when we come to information taking in and sharing.
I think it's also important for our healthcare providers to step in and to put information that is right, relevant, and to spread that information prolifically as well. Yeah.
Agreed. All right, we have a question from K. Sunita Das, who asked, based on the current trend of such dis or misinformation, is there a yardstick or criteria that has been developed or that we can use when consuming information?
I haven't personally come across a particular final yardstick. There was that particular graph I showed, which was a study which was presented in the Lancet, looking at the ways of fighting an infodemic, implementing alert system detection, intervention systems. And I think that there is going to be a future of developing systems that will actually start to put that in place. But we need to understand more why people do share misinformation or disinformation. And we need to therefore understand the root cause of that before we can fully control that within our environment. I recommend reading some of these papers. Some of these papers were actually generated before the pandemic, dealing with the infodemic that was around political as well as medical as well.
All right. We've got another question from an audience member, and it's from Jawad Koris, who asked, you've said you've spoken about the ivermectin scandal, but how about the remdesivir scandal? Would you like to expound a bit on that? What happened? How did it happen? And how can we prevent such things?
I don't know whether I can answer specifically on that particular scandal in terms of that. I think one of the challenges that we have in healthcare is what people believe was a natural way of treating a particular drug with a drug, or whether it was intentional to use a drug because it was available and people were going to get paid for that particular drug, is quite difficult, because often these drugs which are identified have got something behind them. The ivermectin is because of some control of RNA within that. So somebody may have an idea why that should be of value, and therefore they push it forward. And I think, I mean, I was looking back at the World Health Organization's, their recommendation again, I can't even say the drug, in 2020, they issued a conditional recommendation against the use of it within hospitalized patients. So even within that language, we see that it's conditional because trials may take place. We may be finding a particular use of that. And one of the challenges that we've seen in social media is that the more alarmist the information, 70% of it will be retweeted. And also, when you look at the types of tweets that healthcare professionals make around fact, they tend to be couched in warnings. You know, this may be right, it may not be. Whereas what you find with fake information is it's very factual, it's very absolute, and therefore people will take the absolute and they won't necessarily look at the warnings associated with real information. So there is a challenge, and that particular drug may in the future have some impact, it may not. We know that the risk of misinformation or disinformation at a time can cause particular problems. And all I would say is, let's not perpetuate that. Let's go back and now look at those research trials and say, does that drug now have any efficacy within there? I'm not saying it does or doesn't at this stage. And I don't think the World Health Organization have updated since that last announcement. I may be wrong, but yeah.
Right. Okay. This is a question from myself. You know, in Singapore, we have actually we've laws. The government has put in place some laws to prevent the spread of fake news, and these measures, these laws, some actually find too strict to controlling. They say it's not great for society. But do you think actually these measures will be able to stop the infodemic, and are they justified given how you mentioned how the consequences of fake news can be very serious?
I think social media platforms have a fantastic way of connecting the world, allowing people to speak where sometimes they don't have a voice. I prefer it where there isn't that kind of level of control. However, when it comes to health information, which is potentially dangerous, I think we need to find ways amongst the social media platforms to way of identifying that, being warned in advance before you consume or share that information. This has not been proven. This is not valid healthcare treatment at this stage. It is a real challenge. I think we should be campaigning to help our public understand what is fake and what is fiction, as well as our public in terms of allowing them access to these platforms as well.
Right. And I'm actually curious to know, do you know if do you have data or any information on where the infodemic or what type of countries the infodemic is more prevalent? Is it in countries which are more technologically advanced, where there's easy access to worldwide information, or in countries which might not necessarily be as connected, and so they have to rely on traditional news sources, but they might also receive fake information or false information through word of mouth?
I don't have the exact data in terms of the way that the countries are impacted, but what we have seen in terms of open access journals is where journals are not regulated, or predatory journals who are basically taking information from small studies without peer review. There is a risk that that information can proliferately go out and be spread, and there isn't the peer review that you would expect in some of those journals. So I think there is evidence that if you don't have access to evidence, high quality information, then there's more likely to be misinformation and disinformation in the public space. And I would encourage us, and Elsevier, we try to make all of our information available globally so that we can put that COVID information out there factually in front of people, and they can use that as their source, or the World Health Organization as well. So there are possibly numbers in terms of where they are occurring more, but social media globally and pockets in different countries is massive.
Right. I think we've got time for maybe one more question, and I think it's something that you've covered before, but let's just expound a little bit. It's from Ronaldo Latoja, who asks, how do you educate people when it's the government officials who are the ones who are spreading mis or disinformation? Maybe not purposely, but because they themselves are misinformed.
It is a really difficult problem. You have to, you only have to look at Donald Trump's presentation when he talked about disinfectants and turn to his medical advisors and actually said, well, can't we just, perhaps inject this? And you start to see the faces of these people. How do you control leadership when information is put out there? Perhaps it was genuinely, is there nothing we can do to try and solve this problem? But we need to encourage our political leadership to use control, to pause, to understand the people they're talking to, and to put out information which is only trusted. And we would only encourage, I think, the public to read trusted information and then to pause before they actually forward that on to other people to make sure as well. It's a very difficult area.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Morris, Mr. Tim Morris there. And I think that's all the time we have for this session. Thanks again to all the audience members who submitted your questions. If you'd like to reach Mr. Tim Morris and his team from Elsevier, you can always connect with them on the sponsors tab on the platform. So thank you, Mr. Tim Morris, and hope you enjoy the remaining 2 days of the conference.